My name is Dr. Chris Fuller. I'm an Associate Professor in Modern US History at the University of Southampton, and this lecture explores the rise of America's national security ideology, lessons from World War II, and the causes of the Cold War. Now, in April 1965, when seeking to justify America's involvement in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson used a speech to set out the case in the following way.
Why must this nation hazard its ease and its interest and its power for the sake of a people so far away? We fight because we must fight if we are to live in a world where every country can shape its own destiny, and only in such a world will our own freedom be finally secure.
So what Johnson argued here was that the United States actually had little choice but to defend South Vietnam, because a failure to do so would mean that they would lose control of the external environment, and that doing that would mean that in some way, some configuration of hostile forces may eventually threaten the United States, or at least force it into a defensive posture where it would have to exist as some sort of garrison state, which would radically alter the American way of life. Essentially, what Lyndon Johnson is talking about here is the national security ideology. So to understand the outbreak of the Cold War, we must trace the emergence of this national security as a foreign policy doctrine, one that came to define the safety of the United States in extremely broad terms, both geographically and ideologically. Robert Osgood was one of the first scholars to really start thinking seriously about the idea of national security as a driver of American foreign policy in the 1950s. And what he pointed out is that security, in its broadest sense, is subjective. It is an absence of fear. Now, being subjective is very important for a foreign policy because what it means is it is based upon reality, but also upon perceptions. So national security is both based in the real world and based in the political world of rhetoric. If a leader can convince their public that they are unsafe, then that might allow them to unlock additional policy options and greater power. On the other hand, if they can convince them that they are safe, then they will be seen as being successful in providing national security. The Cold War historian Melvin Leffler gave us an excellent, concise definition of national security policy with his essay in 2004, where he set it out as national security policy encompasses the decisions and actions deemed imperative to protect domestic core values from external threats. So let's explore where this ideology actually came from. And I want to do that with three key areas of argument. First, we're going to explore the concept of free security in the United States foreign policy. Then we'll explore economic security and insecurity, and national security and insecurity. And we'll finish by drawing together some conclusions and thinking about what this really means for the study of the Cold War. So starting with the idea of free security. So after the war with Britain ended in 1815, the United States enjoyed the unique condition of what C. Vann Woodward dubbed free security. It's probably best summed up by the French diplomat to Washington, D.C., Jules Desserand, who argued, on the north, she had a weak neighbour. On the south, another weak neighbour. On the east, fish. On the west, fish. And what Desserand was talking about here, and what free security is essentially based on, is the geography of the United States. So this is partly American exceptionalism, a belief here that they have a unique and exceptional geography, but it is also based upon fact. America's placement allowed for this sense of free security. The idea that America didn't need to enter into entangling alliances to protect itself because it didn't really have any major threats nearby. This absence of any plausible threat of invasion inspired prohibitive ideas of self-defense. So in 1837, the United States introduces the Caroline ruling, which essentially says you cannot preemptively attack somebody who might be a threat to you. You have to wait for the actual attack to emerge. Now, of course, that's quite easy for the United States when that attack would either come from Canada or Mexico, or that attack would have to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific, giving you plenty of time to see it coming. At least that's certainly the case in 1837. Later, this would be built into Article 51 of the UN Charter, which again essentially argues that preemptive military force is illegal and cannot be used. Post 9/11, the United States would challenge that article itself, but certainly for the first 100 years of American international diplomacy, the country very much stood for the prohibitive use of force. In fact, it was America's neighbors that really suffered chronic insecurity from what was dubbed the dangerous nation. Between 1776 and 1848, the United States invaded Canada twice, pushed Spain out of Florida and Mexico out of Texas, and seized half of Mexico's territory. So actually the greatest threat in the Americas really was the United States itself. And we can see this idea of free security persisting right the way into the 20th century. And so when it came to the outbreak of the First World War, this idea that America can stand off safe at a distance very much shaped America's initial policy of neutrality. This idea, as stated by Wilson in his message to Congress here, that the United States must be impartial in thought as well as action, must put a curb upon sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party in a struggle before another. So free security in this sense meant that American policymakers, and in this case President Woodrow Wilson, were confident that they could stand off and allow this European conflict to play out. And that is actually sustained in the first years of that war, even as American casualties begin to mount from U-boat attacks. And it's not actually until the Zimmerman telegram in February 1917 and this sense that Germany, through seeking an alliance with Japan and Mexico, actually might be beginning to threaten that free security bubble of the United States by forming an alliance with one of those neighbors and also with another potentially hostile regional power. When the United States does eventually enter the war, what's important here is that actually it doesn't enter necessarily in defense of itself. There is still a sense of free security, that the United States is safe from invasion and attack. Actually, if we look at Wilson's war message from April 1917, what he argues is that there can't be any assured security for the democratic governments of the world if a state like Germany is allowed to continue to behave the way that it is. The world must be made safe for democracy. So America's entry into the First World War wasn't because the country itself felt under threat. Free security still meant that that wasn't the case, but actually that the global atmosphere for democracy itself was becoming toxic and something needed to be done. So America entered the war to protect democracy more than its own homeland. That sense again plays out with the policy decisions that followed. So over 3 votes, the US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's proposal for membership of the League of Nations. This idea that the United States must take up a key role as a global policeman. Once again, free security meant that when this conflict was ended in 1918, the prevailing sense amongst American policymakers and gradually amongst the American public was that actually America should withdraw back within its free security bubble. And we see that play out in the following election. So with the wartime economic boom having collapsed and a deep recession having set in, Warren Harding's Republican campaign rejected Wilson's advocacy for a more interventionist America, and it campaigned on a populist theme of a return to normalcy. And you may recognize the slogan in the Harding poster here of America First, this idea that America has done its part and now we must return back to our free security bubble where we are able to remain neutral and detached from these other powers. So this theme, combined with the fact that Harding outspent his Democrat opponent by a ratio of 4-1, resulted in a landslide victory in the 1920 election and the return to an isolationist foreign policy for the United States. And the endurance of free security contributed significantly to that rejection of Wilsonianism. The two could not coexist. In the absence of a clear and present danger, Americans were unwilling to shoulder the burden of upholding international security. This is well summed up by the Republican senator from Nebraska, William Borah, who argued, had the United States entered the League of Nations, we would have forfeited and surrendered once and for all the great policy of no entangling alliances. He's quoting Jefferson there, upon which the strength of this republic has been founded for 150 years. So even after the First World War had shown the interconnectedness of a conflict and the way that the events in one continent or one region could expand and spread out elsewhere, there was still this sense of American exceptionalism in terms of their geography and their free security. This really begins to crumble, however, when globalization of economies starts to impact the United States and demonstrate that actually it's becoming increasingly impossible in the 20th century to isolate yourself from other nations. The Great Depression exposed emergent flaws in the free security doctrine. The economic backlash, which caused the collapse of stability in Europe and East Asia, revealed an increasingly globalized world was not just interconnected, but also interdependent. For certain policymakers with foresight, such as Franklin Roosevelt, this revelation signaled the end of America's free security, both at home and abroad. This was an outdated concept that simply couldn't survive when the events that were occurring in different countries and continents could have such a significant impact upon the United States. Following his inauguration in 1933, following his 1932 election victory, Franklin Roosevelt's goal was to provide socio-economic security for Americans, in particular those hit hardest by the collapse in living standards and the crisis of unemployment. Speaking in a message to Congress about his objectives in June 1934, Roosevelt stated, "Among our objectives, I place the security of their men, women, and children of the nation first." The vehicle for providing this security was the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's set of government-driven policies and agencies through which Roosevelt reassured Americans that the government would provide them with security, that it would look after them, not just in the short term, but with a permanent sense of safety and stability. And here in this propaganda policy poster for the New Deal, you can see the playing on that term of security, this idea that the government will take responsibility of security for the American family. And it's difficult to make clear just how significant a change this is. Nothing in American foreign policy really compares to the New Deal as a regime of centralized risk management. Its combination of public administration and broad coverage, and of course, when speaking in these terms, we have to be conscious of the fact that there were significant areas of exclusion here. African Americans, for example, didn't have access to a lot of the packages that were offered through the New Deal. There were compromises made with corporations. There were certain deals, certain trade-offs, but collectively, we are still looking at a transformative period of American attitudes towards risk. Essentially what happened is insecurity, which up until this point had been believed to just be a characteristic of capitalism. Boom-bust cycles were natural, they were a component of free markets, and there was nothing you can do about it. The American dream and rugged individualism, the ability to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, meant that some Americans would be extremely wealthy and some Americans would die homeless on the street. And that was just the way that it was. Well, what the New Deal did, and the ideas of security that came with it, was that insecurity was transformed from a necessary condition of capitalism to something that the government took a responsibility to seek to reduce, or even possibly to eliminate entirely. The next factor of this, once economic security had become a core aspect of American domestic thinking, was the foreign policy aspect and the ideas of national security and the insecurity that comes along with that. So after initially focusing upon restoring the domestic security, the protection of the United States national security from a chaotic but increasingly integrated world system pervaded Roosevelt's later policy. And as the scholar of American foreign policy, Andrew Preston, argues, of the wartime leaders, only FDR had a truly global vision. Roosevelt often referred to maps and distances, to the theoretical possibilities of how one land mass could be connected to another by sea or air travel, and he viewed world events, threats, as well as opportunities as fundamentally interrelated, interconnected, and interdependent. And I've chosen this image very deliberately. This globe here was a gift to Roosevelt, a Christmas present in December 1942, gifted to him by the United States Army. An identical globe was given to Churchill and to General George C. Marshall. And actually the men would refer to these globes when having conversations and planning the war. And Roosevelt kept this by his desk and would regularly use it to talk with advisors and policymakers and his generals about distance and space. He'd already had some interest and expertise in this from his time serving as Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he'd always had an interest in geography. But as the international environment became increasingly chaotic in the early 1940s, Roosevelt's interest in geography became more and more significant. Just as the New Deal saw a group of intellectuals brought together alongside practical policymakers to form a brains trust from whom Roosevelt would pick and choose his favoured ideas, the same thing happened in foreign policy. By the late 1930s, Roosevelt surrounded himself with groups of scholars and policymakers, mostly drawn from Ivy League universities, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, who coalesced around a new geopolitical way of thinking, arguing that the evolution of technology, in particular air power, and political developments, most worrying to them, the spread of totalitarian regimes, were converging to present an unprecedented threat to the United States. Essentially, the tyranny of distance was being shrunk by technological innovation, and that was bringing these dangerous totalitarian governments within striking distance of the United States. Essentially, there was a realization amongst these policymakers and scholars that the old traditional view of free security was becoming rapidly obsolete and out of date. As Edward Mead Earle posed it, the resulting encirclement would put us in a position of great peril regardless of the size of our army and navy. What he was talking about here then was this idea that regardless of what's happening around the world, regardless of how large America's military might become, a purely defensive posture based upon hiding within America's own borders would lead to the United States being encircled and cut off in a way that they simply would not be able to survive. So this is very much that view that Lyndon Johnson was channeling when trying to justify American involvement in South Vietnam. This sense that America needs to project outside of its immediate region if it is to prevent threats from gathering and overwhelming it. Roosevelt's problem here, though, was convincing an American public that faith in this long-term sense of free security was now misplaced. That intervention in what they perceived as a foreign war was actually going to be in their best interests. He had to challenge that neutrality that had been core to the American way of seeing themselves in relation to the rest of the world. And this challenge typically has been overly simplified in some scholarship and in traditional teaching, where it's pretty much just presented as a case of internationalists like Roosevelt having to deal with the dominance of isolationism. But actually, many Americans who opposed American intervention in the Second World War were not isolationists at all. If we take Herbert Hoover, for example, he was deeply opposed to intervention, but he was certainly no callous parochial nativist. Hoover had been deeply involved in European relief efforts after the First World War. In the newsreel footage here, you can see crowds coming to greet him and very much praising him, worshipping him almost as a savior, as a man that organized relief efforts and rehousing, rehabilitation. He was seen as a hero. And this experience of the consequences of the First World War, this time he spent traveling through Europe, meant he had a deep and detailed understanding of the crisis in the international system. He also viewed Germany, Nazi Germany, as morally repugnant. He was deeply opposed to it. However, like so many other Americans, to him it was not conceivable that Germany could threaten the free security of the United States. So they simply didn't want to risk America entering the war because there was still this firm sense that their geography meant that they were kept isolated and safe. So it's not isolationism in this sense, it is the ideology of free security still existing. So Roosevelt set about trying to dismantle this overconfidence, this perception of security that the American people held. So in 1938, the year of appeasement at Munich, a year after the Japanese invasion of China, Roosevelt invoked the term national security in his rhetoric more times than all previous presidents combined. So in a crucial period between 1938 and 1941, FDR used major speeches and his fireside chats to warn Americans that they could not inhabit the same world as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The president used his powers of communication, and he was a very, very capable speaker, remember, with deep trust from the American public. Well, he used those powers of communication to promote a national insecurity, to essentially dismantle the American confidence in free security and to make them feel that they were in a much more dangerous position than they generally perceive themselves to be, in order to win support for his expansive ideas of national security, in order to convince the American public that they had to get in this war. And if we listen to the fireside chats, we can identify examples of this selling of the concept of national security. So here, for example, Roosevelt, in a very famous fireside chat from December 1940, discusses the idea of how American national security is under threat and what is required essentially the timescale that's required for American intervention.
My friends, this is not a fireside chat on war. It is a talk on national security, because the nub of the whole purpose of your president is to keep you now and your children later and your grandchildren much later out of a last-ditch war for the preservation of American independence and all of the things that American independence means to you and to me and to ours.
So there's a few aspects of the national security ideology that we can draw out of this extract. First, you get this much greater sense, this post-New Deal sense of the responsibility of an American president to keep citizens safe. Roosevelt takes that on proudly as a responsibility. Also, we get the idea here, this isn't about war, this is about national security, this is existential. Roosevelt here talks about the idea of needing to preserve American independence and all that that means to the American people. And also note, he talks here about the need to intervene earlier so that the American people don't have to get involved in a last-ditch war. So again, this is that thinking that him and that circle of advisors are starting to have in foreign policy about these emergent threats, that if they don't get out there into the world and do something about it, then this defensive posture, this neutral position, the free security bubble is not going to keep them safe in the long term. And this speech continues, and here we can see the links to the ideas of technology and the way that that feeds into greater insecurity for the United States.
Some of us like to believe that even if Britain falls, we are still safe because of the broad expanse of the Atlantic and of the Pacific. But the width of those oceans is not what it was in the days of clipper ships. At one point between Africa and Brazil, the distance is less from Washington than it is from Washington to Denver, Colorado. 5 hours for the latest type of bomber. And at the north end of the Pacific Ocean, America and Asia almost touch each other. Why, even today we have planes that could fly from the British Isles to New England and back again without refueling. And remember that the range of the modern bomber is ever being increased.
Here then we have this sense of conflating geography, that keen interest in distance that Roosevelt and his advisors hold, and the continued attempts to undermine free security. So making the American public aware that they are not so distant from their enemies, that threats can now reach out and touch them. So this fireside chat is being used to breed a sense of national insecurity, to try to make the public malleable to the policies that Roosevelt wants them to support. Following the Greer incident, which was an episode in which a German submarine, a Nazi submarine, fired upon an American ship, and Roosevelt gave authority for the ships to fire back, FDR continued to use the fireside chats to wake the American people up, as he saw it, to the increased threat that is surrounding them.
It is time for all Americans, Americans of all the Americas, to stop being deluded by the romantic notion that the Americas can go on living happily and peacefully in a Nazi-dominated world. We cannot bring about the downfall of Nazism by the use of long-range invective. But when you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he is struck before you crush him. These Nazi submarines and raiders are the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. They are a menace to the free pathways of the high seas. They are a challenge to our own sovereignty. They hammer at our most precious rights when they attack ships of the American flag, symbols of our independence, our freedom, our very life.
Within this fireside chat then, national security is presented as ideological as well as geographical. Roosevelt talks about the threats to the American way of life as well as to American sovereignty. Therefore, what is being called for here is the protection of the American way of life. That is what national security is about and requires. Roosevelt codified this American way of life and with it the ideological goals of national security with his Four Freedoms Address at his 1941 inauguration. Symbolized here by these oil paintings painted by Norman Rockwell in 1943. The four freedoms, as Roosevelt set them out, were freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Later on, these would go on to be the cornerstones of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Roosevelt's wife would help shepherd through the United Nations after his passing. But during the wartime foreign policy, these ideas, these universal ideas, amounted to what the historian Elizabeth Bogward has described as a New Deal for the world. So just as laissez-faire economics produced the Depression, so unregulated world politics had produced the risks posed by the rise of dictators and the collapse of international security. And just as with the New Deal, the solution to domestic insecurity was for the government's management of socio-economic life, so the key to national security was the government's involvement in the removal of risk through the regulation of international affairs. Just as the government took on responsibility for the protection of its own citizens domestically, so too the government committed itself to take on a greater role in the protection of its citizens in the international sphere. As threats came to the United States, real or perceived, whether they were from the Soviet Union or Korea or China or Vietnam, so too the United States pushed out its own forces. And in a similar way to the domestic New Deal, the government's response was a series of agencies, alphabet agencies for the globe, whether it is the United Nations, Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the National Security Act, seeing the creation of the Department of Defense, or the Central Intelligence Agency, or even in 1952, the creation of the National Security Agency itself. Collectively, these bodies were a way for the United States to shape the international environment outside of its borders, well beyond the free security bubble, to essentially intercept, interdict, or prevent the rise of threats against the United States. And from this map here in the bottom corner, you can see each of these red circles was a planned US base being planned in the closing years of the Second World War by Roosevelt's government. And what you can see here is this clear sense that in order to protect American national security, you need to push out and have bases and frontiers well beyond your own homeland. So this is a full rejection of the idea of unique American geography and the the free security that provides, and a shift to the need to provide national security by controlling your external environment. This lecture then has presented the idea that free security reigned for over 100 years as the core American ideological position for foreign policy, which allowed them to avoid entangling alliances and was based upon this conviction that threats simply couldn't reach them. The global impact of the Wall Street crash, which revealed a deep American interdependence upon world markets, combined with the rising threat to the international political environment caused by the rise of totalitarian leaders and fascistic empires, combined to essentially create a new ideology. And Roosevelt was able to use a sense of insecurity within the American public to push these new ideas of a much greater commitment of American foreign policy. So let's draw a few conclusions from this. Despite his impressive rhetoric and the relentless push to convince the American public that free security was a bust, actually it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that this doctrine of national security was really legitimated. The warnings that had been coming from time and time that technology, in particular air power, was shrinking space and distance, and that the Atlantic and the Pacific were no longer the buffers that they had once been, was clearly proven with the attack upon Pearl Harbor. And even though it wasn't the American homeland, the American public could not escape the sense that these new technologies made them more vulnerable than before. So in a very short space of time, the idea of national security went from being a radical and debated idea held by a handful of academics and far-sighted policymakers to being the conventional wisdom of US foreign policy. The term national security became ubiquitous. Roosevelt had set up the foundations for America's post-World War II foreign policy. But in doing so, he had also laid in the roots of the Cold War. Roosevelt himself would almost certainly have been aghast at such an expansive view of the requirements of US defense. It was set out first in the Truman Doctrine and then NSC 68, which saw conflict extend to the wars in Korea and Vietnam. Roosevelt himself was convinced that the United States could coexist alongside the Soviet Union, partly based upon his more positive relationship with Stalin, but also just a sense of universal values overriding economic models. So these ideas that four freedoms are completely universal and that the United Nations was going to be a body which would ensure that ideological competition had an outlet, a pressure valve that would allow you to avoid these conflicts, was key in Roosevelt's thinking. The belief he had that the Soviet Union could be involved in the Bretton Woods system and it would be part of the IMF and the World Bank was in itself evidence that he was utterly convinced that ideological conflict between these two was by no means inevitable. But when we look at the Cold War, when we look at Lyndon Baines Johnson's reasoning for American involvement in Vietnam, we can see that actually the Cold War was in a large part the product of Roosevelt's successors following the doctrine of national security to its logical conclusion. The continued pushing out of American frontiers, the continued interdicting of threats before they emerge, essentially is what led the United States to and American policymakers to believing the need to build up their armed forces, the need to intervene in conflicts and wars around the world. So one of the greatest tragedies of Roosevelt's pursuit of national security is that it plays such a significant role in creating sustained insecurity for the American public and policymakers. And as a final point, where Wilson had failed to convince the American public to take on this bigger role and to dismiss free security and to reject the neutrality that came from that and the isolationism, and to take up a world take up a world role, is that he had argued that Americans needed to make the world safe for democracy. Roosevelt, who had delivered hundreds of speeches in support of the League of Nations, learned from that bruising experience. And where he succeeded is he took those Wilsonian values of making the world safe for democracy, but he bolted them onto a fear for America's physical vulnerability in this integrated global system. So rather than telling Americans that they needed to make the world safe for democracy, Roosevelt sold a more expansive American role and the national security ideology by telling Americans that they had to make the world safer for themselves. And that continues to be a driving force behind American foreign policy today. Thank you very much for your time.